They didn't deny it. They buried it. For more than 30 years, Area 51 officially did not exist. No maps, no budgets, no acknowledgement. Yet inside that erased stretch in Nevada desert, the United States developed technologies that appeared decades ahead of known science. Aircraft without conventional lift, materials that healed themselves, signals that outran radar theory. None of it was supposed to be possible, and none of it was explained. This is not about rumors. It is about patterns. Classified flight logs show performance jumps with no engineering lineage. Metallurgical reports describe alloys with isotopes not found on Earth. Witnesses were not corrected. They were reassigned. Then the records stop. No press releases. No public failures. No follow-up questions. Something was recovered. Something was studied. And something was deliberately mislabeled. If this technology was not human in origin, then modern aerospace surveillance and materials science rest on a false foundation. And if that is true, then the real history of technological progress has been quietly rewritten. The file opens here. Groom Lake sits inside a dry basin in southern Nevada, surrounded by mountains, restricted airspace, and silence. Today it is commonly called Area 51. For most of the 20th century, it officially did not exist. The U.S. government denied its presence, refused to acknowledge its purpose, and redirected all questions into dead ends. Yet billions of dollars flowed into the site, and the most advanced aerospace projects in history passed through its hangars. The public explanation was simple. Area 51 was a testing ground, experimental aircraft, classified weapons, Cold War necessity. That explanation works until timelines are compared. From the 1950s onward, American aerospace technology did not evolve gradually. It jumped. Aircraft appeared that bypassed expected developmental stages. Materials entered service before the scientific principles behind them were fully understood. Surveillance capabilities emerged that outpaced both adversaries and existing theory. Each leap coincided with heightened activity at Groom Lake. Each leap was followed by silence. Across declassified documents, leaked testimonies, and fragmented oversight reports, the same structure repeats. Anomalous object recovered, non-standard material analyzed, a compartmentalized program created, personnel isolated under non-disclosure. The technology does not debut immediately. It waits. Then, years later, a diluted version appears in the public world. Stripped of its origin, renamed, normalized. This is not a story about one crash or one secret aircraft. It is about a system designed to absorb the unknown, fragment it, and convert it into advantage while erasing its source. The language inside the files changes over time. Early documents speak of evaluation. Later ones refer to exploitation. By the 1980s, a different term appears more frequently: translation. That word matters. Translation implies an intelligence gap, something observed but not fully understood, something advanced enough to require interpretation rather than invention, and it explains why so many individuals connected to the site described the same frustration. They were not building new technology. They were trying to understand someone else's. The next 10 cases are not rumors. They are points on a pattern, and the first incident was already classified. In the spring of 1947, months before Roswell entered public memory, military survey teams were already operating in the Nevada desert near a dry lake bed called Groom Lake. Officially, they were conducting routine geological assessments. Unofficially, transport aircraft began landing at nearby strips with no flight plans on record. Locals noticed convoys moving at night. Equipment arrived that had no connection to nuclear testing or conventional aviation. Something had already gone wrong, or arrived. The first anomaly was not a craft. It was debris, scattered across several miles of desert floor, collected quietly, without press briefings or recovery crews marked for accident response. Army engineers documented fragments that were unnaturally light, resistant to heat, and incapable of permanent deformation. One report notes material that returned to original form after applied force. The language is restrained. The implications were not. At the time, No American laboratory could manufacture such alloys. No adversary was known to possess them. Then the chain reaction began. Within weeks, the federal government invoked emergency land seizure orders around Groom Lake. Ranchers were removed. Airspace was rerouted. What had been an obscure testing range became a controlled exclusion zone. Construction followed immediately. Hangars, runways, underground storage. Budgets were diverted through the Atomic Energy Commission to avoid congressional oversight. The site did not yet have a name, but it already had a purpose. No one explained the urgency. A small recovery team was reassigned from Wright Field to Nevada. Their task was labeled for material evaluation. Internal memos show confusion. The debris did not respond to known cutting tools. Spectrographic analysis produced inconsistent results. Isotopic ratios did not align with terrestrial sources. One technician wrote that the samples behaved more like engineered systems than inert matter. Then he vanished from subsequent paperwork. His name appears once more in a reassignment order. No discharge, no death record. His personnel file ends mid-sentence. He missed his daughter's first birthday. That detail survives only in a handwritten margin note from a payroll clerk. By late 1948, the Air Force changed strategy. Instead of transporting materials elsewhere, they brought the scientists to the desert. Groom Lake became permanent, not for testing aircraft, but for containment. Whatever had been recovered was not going to be paraded through existing institutions. It would be isolated, studied in fragments, compartmentalized until no one person understood the whole. Publicly, nothing happened. Privately, everything accelerated. The decision to build Area 5-1 was not proactive. It was reactive, a response to an encounter that could not be explained, replicated, or acknowledged. The base was not created to invent the future. It was created because the future had already arrived, unannounced. And by 1952, the airspace above it was permanently sealed. The material was never given a name. In internal documents, it was referred to only by inventory number, weight, and containment protocol. By 1951, several fragments recovered from the desert had been transferred to a secured hangar at Groom Lake and placed under continuous observation. The objective was simple in wording and impossible in practice. Determine composition, origin, and application. The first tests failed immediately. When subjected to cutting tools, the material resisted deformation. When bent, folded, or compressed, it returned to its original shape without heat or external energy input. Microscopic analysis showed no grain boundaries consistent with known metallurgy. Electron microscopy revealed layered structures that appeared organized rather than crystalline. One lab note states plainly, this is not an alloy in any conventional sense. Then the isotopes came back. Mass spectrometry conducted on a microshaving produced ratios that did not match any known terrestrial source. The elements themselves were familiar, but their atomic distributions were wrong, too stable, too precise, as if engineered at a level below conventional smelting. When the report reached senior oversight, it was immediately reclassified. Further testing required a new clearance tier. Only a handful of scientists were allowed continued access. None were told where the material came from. What disturbed engineers most was not its strength or flexibility. It was its behavior. The material responded to stress, as if it anticipated it. Deformation occurred without microfracturing. There was no fatigue curve. One physicist compared it to a system with memory, though no circuitry or power source could be identified. Another wrote that it behaves less like metal and more like a decision. Those comments did not circulate. By 1954, the program was split into compartments. One team studied structural properties. Another focused on electromagnetic response. A third attempted replication. All failed. Heating destroyed nothing. Freezing changed nothing. Acid baths did nothing. Yet the fragments remained unchanged, as if insulated from interaction at the atomic level. The frustration took a toll. A senior metallurgist submitted a request to transfer out of the program after 18 months. His exit interview was classified. His reassignment moved him to a remote facility in Alaska. His family followed under a housing assistance order. He never published another paper. Colleagues later noted that he refused to discuss the work, even in private. He missed his brother's funeral. No explanation was given. The breakthrough did not come from understanding the material. It came from copying its limitations. Engineers stopped asking how it was made and began asking how it behaved. By observing stress response, they learned how to design around it. This shift quietly influenced aerospace engineering. Weight-to-strength ratios changed. Heat tolerance assumptions shifted. Materials science advanced faster than theory could justify. Publicly, these advances appeared incremental. Privately, the origin remained sealed. One line in a 1956 memo stands out. It is brief and heavily redacted. Only 4 words remain legible. Source remains non-attributable. That phrase would reappear decades later, because the isotopes did not belong to Earth. By 1952, pilots flying near restricted Nevada airspace began reporting radar contacts that behaved incorrectly. Objects accelerated without afterburn, changed direction without banking, and maintained altitude without visible lift. At first, these reports were dismissed as instrumentation error. Then the instruments were checked. The contacts remained. What followed was not an investigation. It was containment. At Groom Lake, a new test program was initiated under a deliberately misleading designation. Officially, it was propulsion research. Unofficially, engineers were attempting to make something fly without obeying equations they had been taught. Early prototypes were not aircraft in any conventional sense. They were platforms. Smooth, disc-like frames with no wings, no intakes, and no exhaust. They were never meant to be seen. The problem was not power. It was control. Witness logs from the period described test vehicles that could hover silently, then accelerate to supersonic speeds in seconds. No sonic boom. No thermal signature consistent with jet propulsion. Radar operators reported returns that faded and reappeared as if the object had slipped between detection modes. One technician wrote, "The target is not evading radar. It is ignoring it." Flight data was recorded on analog systems, then immediately classified. Engineers struggled to explain what they were seeing. Lift appeared to be generated without airflow. Momentum behaved inconsistently. One internal report concludes that the craft was interacting with the surrounding field, not pushing against it. That sentence was underlined twice. The author was reassigned within weeks. Then came the first fatal test. A pilot with over 2,000 flight hours was selected to push the platform beyond previous limits. He was not told what made the craft fly, only that it did. During a high-altitude maneuver, the vehicle accelerated abruptly. Telemetry spiked. The craft vanished from tracking for 3 seconds, then reappeared inverted and falling. There was no mayday, no explosion, only impact. The incident was recorded as a training accident involving experimental equipment. The wreckage was recovered before dawn. The pilot's name was removed from future rosters. His family received a pension and a warning. He missed his son's graduation. The footage of the flight was sealed under indefinite classification. After that, the program changed tone. Engineers stopped trying to improve performance. They focused on stability, on restraint, on making the craft behave more predictably within human limits. The goal was no longer to match the unknown technology. It was to survive it. By the early 1960s, public aerospace projects began to reflect these lessons. Aircraft appeared that flew higher, faster, and farther than expected. Their designs hinted at compromises, ways to imitate something far more advanced without fully understanding it. The lineage was obscured. The math was adjusted. The origin was erased. Inside Area 51, the original platforms were no longer flown openly. They were studied, parked, taken apart, reassembled, always incomplete. One classified summary from 1963 ends with a sentence that would echo for decades. "The system functions, but not by our rules." That was the moment propulsion laws were quietly rewritten. By the mid-1960s, construction at Groom Lake expanded in a direction never listed in budget summaries. New facilities were built away from runways and hangars, partially buried, with independent power, air handling, and way systems. Official diagrams labeled them as medical support units. The equipment delivered inside told a different story. This was not for pilot recovery. Autoclaves rated beyond standard biohazard levels were installed. Isolation chambers were sealed with redundancies usually reserved for nuclear material. Medical instrumentation arrived that had no application in aerospace testing. Surgeons were flown in under temporary clearance, sworn to compartmentalized non-disclosure, and told only what they needed to operate. No one briefed them on the source. The first samples were not alive. They were tissues, thin sections preserved in inert suspension, exhibiting cellular structures that did not conform to known human or animal biology. Microscopic analysis revealed organization without familiar DNA markers. Cellular walls showed geometric regularity inconsistent with terrestrial evolution. One pathologist noted that the cells appeared engineered rather than grown. That sentence was removed from the final report. Then came the containment failures. In 1967, an internal incident log references exposure protocols being activated without corresponding accident reports. Personnel were quarantined for observation, then quietly released. No public health alerts followed. No medical journals received submissions. Whatever had triggered the response was resolved internally or buried. Oversight tightened. A dedicated wing was sealed off entirely, accessible only through rotating clearance codes. Researchers were prohibited from discussing their findings even with adjacent teams. The work was reframed not as biological study, but as risk assessment, how the material interacted with human systems, whether prolonged proximity produced effects, whether containment was sufficient. One junior medical officer requested transfer after witnessing an autopsy conducted under conditions he later described as clinically impossible. His request was denied. Months later, his service record shows an administrative discharge for psychological instability. He never practiced medicine again. He never went home. By the early 1970s, the biological program was quietly deprioritized. Not because it failed, but because it reached a conclusion no one wanted responsibility for. Internal correspondence suggests the material was not pathogenic, but incompatible. It did not behave like a virus or bacterium. It behaved like something not adapted to Earth at all. The implication was more unsettling than a threat. If the material was non-terrestrial, then its presence was incidental, accidental, not designed for contact, which raised a larger question. If this was not meant for us, what was? That question never reached the committee. Instead, responsibilities shifted. Oversight was transferred away from medical command structures into deeper compartments. The facilities were sealed. The wing was emptied. Some equipment was removed. Some was left behind and entombed. Officially, the biological operations never existed. Unofficially, they changed how the government defined exposure, contamination, and contact forever. And in 1967, all off-world research oversight was quietly moved inland. By the late 1970s, pressure began building outside the fence, not from the public, but from within the system itself. Engineers, analysts, and oversight officers who had spent decades inside classified programs started asking a dangerous question. What if none of this was extraordinary at all? This became the internal counterargument. According to this explanation, Area 51 was not studying alien technology. It was responding to human fear. The Cold War had created an atmosphere where secrecy amplified misunderstanding. Experimental aircraft, exotic propulsion concepts, and advanced materials were misinterpreted by those without full context. Rumors filled the gaps. Myth replaced documentation. In this view, every anomaly had a terrestrial origin, distorted by compartmentalization. It was a clean theory, and for a moment, it almost worked. Internal review panels revisited earlier cases. Soviet aerospace programs were cited. Psychological stress on test pilots was noted. Instrument error was emphasized. Some isotopic anomalies were reattributed to contamination or sampling limitations. The argument was that no single piece of evidence required a non-human explanation, only an unusually aggressive secrecy culture. One classified memo summarized the position bluntly. Extraordinary conclusions are emerging from incomplete access. not extraordinary sources. But the skeptic case had limits. If all observed technologies were human-made, then their development paths should exist somewhere in a record. They did not. Entire stages were missing. Designs appeared without prototypes. Materials entered testing before the science to explain them was published. And certain behaviors, particularly field interactions and stress responses, could not be replicated once original samples were removed from study. A single sentence in a 1981 review acknowledged the problem. Replication has not succeeded despite full theoretical access. The sentence was never resolved. For fairness, one could argue that all recovered materials were advanced human prototypes, misinterpreted under extreme secrecy, and later mythologized beyond their origins. That argument remains officially acceptable. But even the skeptics noticed something unsettling. The most restrictive classifications did not surround flight performance or weapons potential. They surrounded origin. Whenever the question of source appeared in documentation, the language tightened, access narrowed, oversight vanished. Skepticism was tolerated until it approached that boundary. One analyst pushed too far. He requested consolidated access to early material reports to test the human origin hypothesis. His request was denied. 6 months later, his clearance was downgraded due to restructuring. He finished his career in logistics. He never published his findings. He never explained a reassignment to his wife. The skeptic explanation reduced panic. It restored order. It allowed the system to function. But it did not close the case. Because if this was all human technology, then someone had built it far earlier than anyone was willing to admit. And if it wasn't human, then skepticism itself had been carefully engineered to slow the right questions. The data remained classified, and the explanations stopped there. By the early 1980s, the focus inside Area 51 shifted again, not toward discovery and not toward denial, toward imitation. The question was no longer where the technology came from, but how much of it could be made usable without understanding it completely. This was when reverse engineering stopped resembling engineering at all. The systems under study did not respond to disassembly the way human machines do. Components removed from the whole ceased to function meaningfully. Interfaces did not map cleanly. There were no clear power hierarchies, no obvious control chains. Engineers described the systems as nonlinear, but that word failed to capture the problem. The technology did not scale down. It resisted reduction. One project lead wrote that the hardware appeared context-dependent, as if its behavior relied on conditions not easily recreated in a laboratory. When removed from its original configuration, performance degraded in unpredictable ways. Attempts to force compatibility produced failures that could not be diagnosed using standard fault analysis. The technology did not break. It simply stopped cooperating. That realization altered strategy. Instead of tearing systems apart, teams began surrounding them, studying their limits rather than their cores, measuring how they reacted to stress, field interference, temperature gradients, electromagnetic noise. Engineers treated the technology less like a machine and more like an environment. You didn't command it. You negotiated with it. This approach produced results. By observing how these systems failed, researchers learned how to design human technology that mimicked the edges of their behavior, not the source, the shadow. Aerospace designs began incorporating unconventional geometries. Materials science adopted tolerances that made no sense on paper but worked in practice. Control systems became adaptive rather than deterministic. None of this was explained publicly. Inside the base, the psychological cost was mounting. Engineers trained to solve problems found themselves unable to explain why their solutions worked. One senior researcher described the work as building answers without questions. He requested extended leave after suffering insomnia and memory lapses. His request was approved on condition of permanent separation from the program. He never returned. He missed his mother's funeral while under debrief restriction. By 1985, compartmentalization reached its peak. No single team had visibility across systems. Some worked on materials, others on fields, others on human interface effects. No one was allowed to assemble the full picture. That was intentional. Understanding was considered a liability. A classified briefing from that period contains a telling line. Total comprehension is neither required nor desirable. The emphasis is original. From that point forward, success was defined narrowly. Could the behavior be reproduced? Could it be stabilized? Could it be weaponized or defended against? Origin was excluded from performance metrics. The irony was obvious to those inside. They were no longer trying to understand the technology. They were trying to survive proximity to it long enough to borrow pieces of its behavior. Human systems improved rapidly as a result. Theory lagged behind. Explanations were written after deployment, not before. By 1975, clearance levels had doubled. By the end of the decade, even oversight bodies were excluded from certain compartments. Area 51 was no longer a testing site. It was a translation facility. By the late 1980s, Area 51 could no longer operate in isolation. The technologies under study demanded manufacturing capabilities that did not exist inside military laboratories. Precision fabrication, exotic materials processing, computational modeling beyond in-house systems. To move forward, the program reached outward, quietly. Civilian contractors were brought in. They were not told whether designs would be used, only that tolerances were non-negotiable, that materials had to behave in ways existing textbooks did not describe. Entire firms were folded into special access programs without ever seeing the full scope of what they were contributing to. Work was segmented so thoroughly that one contractor might spend years perfecting a component without knowing what it connected to. Some noticed the inconsistencies. Engineers questioned why certain material specifications referenced stress responses rather than load limits. Others wondered why electromagnetic shielding requirements exceeded anything used in nuclear systems. When questions reached too high, contracts were restructured, teams were dissolved, non-disclosure agreements expanded retroactively. Then the acquisitions began. Small technology firms were bought outright after submitting anomalously successful prototypes. Patents disappeared into classified annexes. Innovations that should have disrupted entire industries entered the public market years later in diluted form, stripped of their most unusual characteristics. The original designs never resurfaced. One contractor pushed back. He had been tasked with modeling a control interface that adapted to operator behavior in real time. The system responded not to direct input, but to proximity and anticipation. When he requested clarification on operating theory, he was told none existed. After submitting a report noting that the interface appears to respond as if aware, his contract was terminated. Weeks later, his company was acquired by a defense subsidiary. His name was removed from subsequent documentation. The pressure spread to families. Housing assistance packages came with relocation requirements. Children were moved mid-school year. Spouses were advised not to discuss employment details, even with close relatives. One engineer described the experience as being absorbed into a shadow economy. He stopped attending conferences. He stopped returning calls. He stopped trusting unclassified conversations. A whistleblower emerged briefly in the early 1990s. He contacted a journalist with claims that contractors were reverse engineering technology of unknown origin under government direction. Before the story ran, the journalist received a national security warning. The source recanted publicly, citing stress. Privately, he finalized a divorce and relocated overseas. He never spoke on record again. He missed his sister's wedding. No explanation was offered. Inside Area 51, contractor access was reduced. Work that required civilian expertise was increasingly laundered through intermediaries. No one outside the fence was allowed to see the complete system. The goal was no longer efficiency. It was containment of knowledge. By 1989, internal audits show that more technological innovation was occurring in classified channels than in the civilian sector. The public marketplace became a delayed echo of black programs. Advances appeared without ancestry. Breakthroughs arrived without inventors. The contractors had done their job. They built pieces they were never meant to understand. And by the end of the decade, even they were being pushed out. By the mid-1990s, Something unexpected happened inside the classification system. A routine materials audit flagged a discrepancy that should not have existed. A newly synthesized alloy, developed under a civilian-facing aerospace contract, matched a set of properties recorded decades earlier in a sealed Groom Lake archive. The match was not approximate. It was exact. Density-to-strength ratio, thermal resilience, stress recovery curves. Even the anomalous fatigue behavior lined up. When analysts overlaid the datasets, the graphs were indistinguishable. One engineer noted that the probability of independent convergence was statistically negligible. That comment triggered an automatic escalation. The old file was pulled from cold storage. Buried under layers of redaction was the original isotopic analysis from the early 1950s, the same material first logged after the desert recovery, the same non-terrestrial ratios, the same impossible stability. The breadcrumb left decades earlier had resurfaced, uninvited, and now it was attached to something manufactured by human hands. This was the problem. If the original material had inspired the new one, then its influence had persisted across generations of compartmentalization. Knowledge had been diluted, renamed, and redistributed, but it had not vanished. The system had learned without admitting it. Reverse engineering had succeeded, not through understanding, but through repetition. Oversight reacted immediately. Access to both datasets was restricted to a joint review panel. The classification level was raised above top secret into a category rarely used outside nuclear command structures. Distribution lists were cut in half. Contractors involved in the modern program were informed their work was being rescoped. No further explanation was provided. One analyst was tasked with reconciling the two timelines. His internal memo is brief. It states that the newer alloy could not be fully explained by existing material science, despite being reproducible. The only plausible explanation offered was iterative design guided by unknown benchmarks. He submitted the memo on a Friday. By Monday, his badge no longer opened the same doors. He was reassigned to archival review. 6 months later, he died of a sudden cardiac event at 49. He never saw the disclosure phase he believed was coming. What terrified administrators was not the implication of alien origin. It was confirmation of continuity. The system had been feeding on the same source for over 40 years, slowly translating behavior into function, without ever acknowledging the source itself. The question of origin had been deferred for so long that it now threatened institutional credibility. Admitting the truth would expose how deeply it had shaped modern technology. So the response was decisive. The classification was not loosened. It was hardened. Records referencing isotopic origin were separated from performance data. The breadcrumb was buried again, this time deeper. A final note was appended to the file, for words stamped in red do not correlate, but correlation had already occurred. And from that point forward, the secrecy stopped being defensive. It became absolute. By the early 2000s, sightings began leaking beyond the perimeter again. Not photographs this time, not stories. Data. Civilian radar operators, air traffic controllers, and military pilots were independently reporting the same object, a large, triangular craft moving silently at low altitude, capable of hovering for extended periods before accelerating beyond pursuit. No wings, no exhaust, no sonic boom. The first reports were dismissed as misidentifications. Then they multiplied. Radar tracks showed right-angle turns at speed. Infrared sensors returned cold signatures inconsistent with any known propulsion system. In several cases, the object appeared to drift between radar bands, fading from one frequency and reappearing on another, as if it were not evading detection but slipping out of alignment with it. Inside Area 51, the response was immediate. Archive flight profiles were reopened. The same anomalous performance envelope documented decades earlier reappeared in modern data. Acceleration without inertia effects. Hover without downwash. One analyst wrote a single line in a classified briefing. This is not iterative improvement. The sentence was circled. The briefing never left the room. The craft was observed directly by trained military pilots on multiple occasions. Their reports were consistent. The object displayed no visible control surfaces. It produced no audible noise even at close range. When approached, it did not flee. It repositioned, as if anticipating intercept vectors before they formed. Then came the human cost. A commercial pilot encountered the object during a night flight over the Southwest. He reported visual contact lasting nearly 2 minutes. His aircraft instruments fluctuated briefly, then stabilized. After landing, he filed a formal report. Within weeks, he was grounded pending psychological evaluation. His medical certification was revoked. He never flew commercially again. He missed his mortgage payments. He never retracted his statement. The media response followed a familiar pattern: ridicule, jokes, grainy footage debates. The narrative shifted from technology to belief. Witnesses were framed as mistaken or unstable. The effect was precise. Public curiosity collapsed into self-censorship. Pilots stopped reporting. Controllers stopped filing anomalies. Inside the system, the truth was clearer. Material samples associated with the triangular craft, collected from earlier programs, were re-examined. The same isotopic signature identified decades earlier resurfaced. Same ratios, same stability, same refusal to degrade. The breadcrumb from the 1950s had returned again, now attached to a platform operating in open airspace. Same isotope, same signature, same silence. The implication was unavoidable. Whatever had been studied at Groom Lake was no longer confined. Either the technology had been operational all along, or it was being deployed selectively. Neither explanation was acceptable for public release. So the response shifted. Instead of denial, the strategy became normalization. The phenomenon was reframed as cultural noise. Attention was diluted. Truth was not attacked. It was drowned. One internal summary from this period ends with blunt assessment. Public disbelief now functions as containment. That was the last time the craft was discussed as a problem. After that, it was treated as a constant. Only one question remained unanswered. By the time the program reached the late 2000s, Area 51 had stopped pretending to be a testing ground. The language inside its highest compartments no longer referenced aircraft, weapons, or even research. It referenced interpretation, integration, translation. The shift was subtle but decisive. The central question had finally been reframed, not what the technology could do, but what it was designed to do. A consolidated review was ordered under a classification level that superseded all previous oversight. Fragments from early material recoveries, flight performance data spanning 5 decades, biological containment reports, contractor-derived systems. All of it was pulled into a single analytic framework for the first time. Very few people were allowed to see the result. What emerged was not a weapon system. It was an interface problem. The technologies shared no common manufacturing lineage, but they shared behavior. They operated as if optimized for environments slightly misaligned with Earth's. Propulsion interacted with fields rather than forces. Materials responded to stress as if anticipating outcomes. Control systems favored proximity and intention over direct input. Nothing about them suggested conquest. Everything suggested traversal. One analyst summarized a conclusion in a classified briefing that was later sealed indefinitely. These systems are not tools. They are adaptations. That changed everything. If the technology was not designed for Earth, then Area 51 was never about building superior machines. It was about decoding context, understanding how something built elsewhere could function here at all. The reason progress had been so slow was not incompetence. It was mismatch. Human engineers were translating assumptions across environments they did not fully understand. This reframed the early recoveries, the debris, the materials, the biological samples. None of it showed signs of intentional deployment. No targeting, no signaling, no communication attempts. The most consistent interpretation was accidental presence. Residue, systems not meant to be found, interacting unpredictably with a planet they were never designed for. That realization carried a burden no agency wanted, because if the technology was not meant for us, then the encounters were incidental. And if they were incidental, then whoever built them was operating at a scale where Earth was not central, not hostile, not special, just intersected. One senior official resigned quietly after the review. His exit memo contained a single sentence: "We are not reverse engineering visitors. We are studying leftovers." He never gave another interview. He never corrected the public narrative. He missed his grandson's birth while under exit debrief. After the review, Area 51's mission was narrowed again. Not expansion, not disclosure. Preservation. Maintain containment. Prevent misinterpretation. Above all, avoid forcing conclusions the data could not support. The goal was no longer technological dominance. It was restraint. A final directive was issued and remains active today. It appears at the end of multiple classified documents, unchanged for years. Do not assume intent. That line marks the true purpose of Area 51, not to prove we are not alone, but to manage what happens if we are not the point. The files end there. The question does not.